Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Kate Bowler is an author and assistant professor at Duke Divinity School. She grew up a Mennonite in Canada, but in pursuing a degree in theology, she was drawn to focus her study on a very different religious movement. She writes, "There's a branch of Christianity that promises a direct path to the good life. It is called by many names, but most often it is nicknamed the prosperity gospel for its bold central claim that God will give you your heart's desires, money in the bank, a healthy body, a thriving family, and boundless happiness." She writes, "It is true that the prosperity gospel encourages people, especially its leaders, to revel in private jets and multi-million-dollar homes as evidence of God's love. But among the less well-heeled believers, I sensed a different kind of yearning, one that wasn't entirely materialistic. Believers wanted an escape from poverty, failing health, and the feeling that their lives were leaky buckets." As an observer and researcher, she admits that at some point she succumbed to some of the same tempting lies and distortions of this theology, even if hers was slightly more sophisticated, as she imagined that God would lead her to an incredible and successful life if she was truly faithful. She says, "I felt the lure of the promise that I could curate my life, minimize my losses, and stand on my successes. I had my own prosperity gospel." The idea that God materially blesses those who are faithful can quickly come to mean that those who are wealthy and successful are indeed faithful and favored by God. This formula seems to provide simple, clear answers for how to live life and provides wonderful assurance when things are going well. External signs of success reinforce the sense that God is on your side. But this theology was broken for Bowler when she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and existential doubts and questions erupted. This is when the prosperity gospel fails. In addition to whatever challenge someone is dealing with, questions come like, has God now abandoned me? Is this punishment? The prosperity gospel was on full display with televangelists of the 1980s, but it continues on. And although it's been repackaged for the modern world, the same broken theology was very much present in the time of Jesus. On many occasions, when confronted with people who were afflicted with physical conditions of poverty, Jesus would get questions like, who sinned, this man or his parents? The assumption was that people are stricken with misfortune because they're bad people or have done something wrong. Of course, yes, some bad things do happen to us because we make really bad choices, but we know this is fundamentally misguided as a blanket philosophy. We know that forces beyond our control can often impact us and that answers can be elusive. But it's still a tempting categorical explanation when we're doing well because it seems to make sense of the world somehow. It makes us feel deserving, and it gives those who are aspiring a pathway that seems certain. Be completely faithful, and God will bless your entire life. Today's gospel from Luke 6 counters this damaging theology in the time of Jesus and in our own time. Jesus reverses the conventional wisdom that your external status possessions, and well-being are a direct reflection of God's favor or lack of it. Jesus says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." This is an undeniable statement of God's care and compassion for those who are experiencing suffering. It's a divine commitment of love for the least of us. It's an announcement of a reality that has come to be even if we can't quite see it yet. Jesus is speaking this to his own disciples. And why is that? Because in the course of living out God's mission, disciples can experience suffering. If God's mission calls us to go into pain, grief, hopelessness, poverty, and hunger to help and serve, it may require us to take responsibility somehow. Part of us would rather distance ourselves from the suffering we see in the world, to look away from the grief of those we encounter and know, to protect ourselves from the pain of it all. To take responsibility, though, we have to sacrifice. We have to sacrifice time and our own sense of neglectful contentment and the illusion that everything makes sense for those who make all the right choices. In fact, the false gospel I spoke about earlier might even say it's best if people who are suffering get their due. They deserve it after all. Don't help them. As a result, taking up the servant mindset of Jesus may even result in criticism. And so Jesus tells them, "Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is how the ancestors treated the prophets." In the last couple of weeks, national figures made baseless attacks on Lutheran organizations, claiming that they were committing illegal money laundering. Almost comical. Similar verbal attacks were leveled against Catholic organizations and others. There was no rationale or evidence presented. In fact, these organizations receive regular audits and have high effectiveness ratings. Funding came from Congress. These were lies which provided cover for eliminating funding to resettle legal refugees and provide services for seniors, youth, adoption, financial and marriage counseling, and mental health care, and more. As Lutherans, I guess we can consider ourselves blessed now that we have been defamed on account of the Son of Man to care for our neighbors. To be clear, there is no divine mandate for the precise kind of economy that we should have or exactly how funds should be distributed. People of faith can advocate for some policies over others, but God didn't set out 21st century policy platforms in the Bible. Bush-era policies, in fact, that expanded faith-based social service initiatives don't have to be forever and permanent. But as people of faith, we still hear the call to be compassionate and provide for those who are in need somehow. Our team from All Saints has been doing that in collecting cans for world hunger since 1988. And we've taken on many other projects to help those in need locally and globally over those years as a congregation and as a wider Lutheran church. In Jesus, we seek to follow the example of the Son of God entering into the suffering of the world, but more specifically into the lives of very real people he encounters who are in need. At the very start of today's reading, we hear, "He came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And everyone in the crowd was trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them." God's blessings and in the ministry of Jesus were often made very concrete and real. And on the other hand, Jesus says, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. Now, these aren't easy words for those of us who are doing well. They don't sit well. What exactly does woe mean? It's not specific. It doesn't necessarily imply divine action to directly undermine those who fit these descriptions. But if God is seeking to positively lift up those who are suffering, what will this require of those who are doing well? If we're called to share with the poor and the hungry, will it mean we're called to share our wealth? Is it reasonable that the 3 wealthiest individuals in the United States who now control the same wealth as half of Americans should give a large part of it back into society? Or should we facilitate an even greater acceleration of amassing wealth while cutting programs for those disadvantaged by the economy to fund them? The last time our nation had a titan like this, it was John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil. And he voluntarily, because of his faith, chose to give up 95% of his wealth before he died through philanthropy. It's an extreme example, but what about those of us who have means, even if far more modest? This past fall, I referenced sociologist and political scientist Robert Putnam of Bowling Alone fame. He cites data to show that Americans are the most polarized, isolated, self-focused, and unequal that we've been in 125 years since the 1890s, the era of Rockefeller, which Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. But it glittered only for those at the top. Americans back then had adopted a new philosophy known as social Darwinism, in which people thought money and investment should be taken away from those who had less and specifically given to those who were wealthy, since it was thought that poor people were not deserving, had poor genes, and wealthy people were and had good genes. Sounds like a version, twisted at that, of the prosperity gospel. The argument was to promote the survival of the fittest in human society. Note the death and tremendous suffering for many implied in that. But in the late 19th century, Protestants stepped forward and pointed to the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor." It ultimately led to a movement and a new social consensus in the country, and policies like the New Deal and opportunities that were shared for much of the 20th century. Our reading for today is Luke's version of the Beatitudes, known as the Sermon on the Plain, and it's even more pointed and forceful in its orientation towards social justice, and not just more open to being interpreted spiritually. But woe to you is warning about more than simply compassionate economics in a society. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep, is a warning not to take our own comfort and happiness as something to keep for ourselves, but an invitation to comfort those who are mourning and experiencing sadness. This will require us to give up some of our own contentment and share with them in their time of difficulty. The philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff, who tragically lost his son, begged those who knew him to put away their simple explanations and encouragements, trying to make meaning of it all. As a philosopher, he couldn't find the meaning in his grief. Instead, he invited them to come sit by him on his mourning bench, to simply be by his side. Doing so opens us up to come to terms with our own mortality and grief and to share in the tears. Do we know how to look at pain and suffering and respond, or do we look away? It's human to distance ourselves from pain. On November 10, 1938, people in Nazi Germany woke up to the aftermath of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On that night and into the next day, hundreds of synagogues were burned. Several thousand Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed and looted, with glass windows being shattered, thus the name of the event. Many were murdered. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. It was the culmination of growing hatred and baseless criticism of Jews as a scapegoat for everything that had happened to Germany in the years after World War I. You're seeing an historic photo from that morning. People are walking by a Jewish storefront that is shattered glass. And in the bottom left-hand corner of the photo, you see a couple. And if you look closely, they're smiling. And if we had a video and zoomed in, perhaps it would reveal snickering or laughter. It's to moments such as this that Jesus says, "Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep." Sadly, we know that even those very people in the picture walking by the destruction of their neighbors would likely weep themselves at some future time for the lives lost in the course of World War II and the ultimate destruction of their own country. Live by violence, die by violence. But it's important to note, before we singularly home in on only certain people, to note something about the lack of clarity about this passage. Jesus is speaking these words not to the crowds. Luke specifically says that Jesus reserves this message for his own disciples. He speaks both woes and words of blessings to his very own. And this changes things. It's part of our conventional worldview to see some people as good and some people as bad, some as worthy of God's love and others not. But what if Martin Luther was right? What if each of us is simultaneously saint and sinner? What if there is good and bad in each of us, even those of us who are disciples? The capacity for compassion and indifference in each of us. Blessings and woes are spoken for each of us. What happens when we're the ones who are poor, hungry, and weeping, and we become blessed? What if we finally arrive? Are we then part of a new permanent class of those blessed by God? Or must we now be aware that we have to share in the burdens of those who have nothing, lest we become the new satisfied ones that overlook the suffering of others, even those who were once our adversaries? Jesus is speaking into a paradox that all of us have to remember. In becoming blessed, we can become the ones who overlook others and neglect them in their time of need. We don't get the luxury of only singling out a few people as the object of criticism. We have to be ready to look at ourselves. The Sermon on the Plain is a very concrete and unmistakable message of how God sees justice. It's a welcome change to gospels of prosperity that would make us see ourselves strictly as God's favored or unfavored people. All that we have is a gift of God, and Jesus wants us to know God's own heart. That as long as our neighbors are in need and we have the capacity to help and serve, we have a calling to do so, even if that brings us closer to the pain of their hardship. As long as we or our neighbors find ourselves poor, hungry, or in sadness, God has not abandoned us. But God has in fact entered into this world to sit by us on our mourning bench and to share our suffering and to also share the hope and love of God for this new day. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.